I'm Alex Faltrates, and this is the Sunday Book Circle for The Man Who Shot Out My Eye Is Dead by Chanelle Benz. The Man Who Shot Out My Eye Is Dead is a collection of short stories, many of them westerns or slave narratives, but a few of them contemporary stories taking place in the South. I'm just going to talk about each one in turn and also talk about their respective endings. West of the Known is about Lavinia, a half-Native American woman in the Wild West. When her half-brother takes her from her aunt and uncle's house, killing them along with her cousin for justified reasons, it's clear that this isn't going to be a happy story or a happy collection of stories. This story has no quotes for dialogue, and I hate that. Writers do this as a weak way of showing that they are playing with form, but all it does is confuse readers. The mechanics of prose are there for clarity. There is no reason beyond pretentiousness to forgo quotation marks. Beyond that, the prose is amazing in this story. It captures the voice of Lavinia and the time period. The one line, "Through the dark I followed him," isn't just poetic and descriptive, it's also foreshadowing. Lavinia, like a lot of women in this point in history, does not have a lot of opportunities for a good life. Her half-brother, Jackson, is a classic anti-hero, and takes her from the frying pan and into the fire. He keeps promising to protect her, but he can't protect her from the danger he puts them both in. I don't know what he could have done differently for Lavinia, nor do I know that Lavinia had any better choices for herself. Maybe that's why this story is so tragic. They both do their best, and it still ends horribly. Well, maybe not their best. Jackson certainly had an anger problem and pushed Lavinia too far. Now, while the story ends abruptly, I do not believe the events are much in question. Mobs are not often swayed from what they set out to do except by force. Adela is a plural first-person story from the perspective of several children in 1829 who follow around Adela, a single woman living alone who likes to entertain the children. The language is formal and complex, suggesting that the temporal distance is vast, and all the children are now adults when they write it. After Adela tells them the name of a man she loves, they start meddling, and as with any story about meddling, it all goes south. This is a weird story. I believe it's a satiristic example of old racial and sexual stories that are picked to death by literary analysis to crow at examples of racism and sexism. The fact that children are writing it seems to be a reference to the fact that a past society as a whole is less mature when compared to more recent times on these subjects. So of course they are racist and sexist. They didn't know any better. The footnotes are the part that especially feel like satire. They are so high-rollingly overreach for racist and sexist connections. For example, the footnote on hobby horse saying its use is about perceived bestiality of sex between West Indies women and Western men is fucking stupid when a reader remembers that the word is chosen by children who all have actual hobby horses in their homes. I hope that Benz was being purposefully cringy with these footnotes, and I've got to imagine that she had to read a lot of footnotes like these from morons who overreached with their quest to find ethical error in older literary works. I can hope, anyway. Accidental is about a woman, Lucy, going to Mississippi to find her father. She reminisces about how she killed a woman in a car accident, something she went to prison for, whom she was similar to. She's searching for her father so that her sick mother can die divorced from him. Lucy has one child from when she was 15 from her dad's second wife's son, Hank. So they were step-siblings. Does that make them step-siblings? This is crazy messed up. Lucy's life is years of awful piled on awful. She feels horrible about the woman she killed and hasn't driven since that night. Hank, though, forces her to drive despite her obvious reluctance. But the story is about Hank and Lucy as non-parents to Levi, their son, and Lucy's bad relationships with her parents. It feels like too much is going on in Accidental. I think the vehicular manslaughter could have been cut. I don't think it adds anything to the themes. It's also similar to Benz's novel, The Gone Dead, which she wrote after this collection of short stories. Despite what I just said about the manslaughter being cut, this short story is still better than that novel. The Diplomat's Daughter is about Natalia, a young woman from a broken home, her mother a drug addict, and her father a diplomat. When she's 19, she goes on a religious mission, meets a mercenary, and is gang raped by some soldiers. The mercenary, Eric, ends up saving her, but because of the rape, Natalia does not want to go back to America. Instead, she decides to work for Eric and let her family think she is dead. I'm not sure what to think of this one. It's almost as if it is about how the world can take daughters from their fathers and destroy nearly everything their fathers taught them. Maybe? That's esoteric, though. I'm sure that's exactly what a contemporary lit academic would say the story is about. Oh, and probably something about how men are interchangeable except for the father figure, and those men all rape. That all feels like a reach to me, so you can see how some of my academic training is coming in here, and I'm trying to beat it back down. It's true, the writers of contemporary lit are trying to create themes, and this one certainly is, but at the same time, on the surface, the story is intriguing. But stories are supposed to have deeper meaning, right? Man, I hope that's not the theme Benz is going for, though. Because if so, whew, what a doozy of an idea, and not in a good way. The peculiar narrative of the remarkable particulars in the life of Orinda Thomas is a slave narrative written from the perspective of Orinda, a poet who thinks she has her freedom, but in fact does not. Crawford, her publisher, has arranged for her to read at a southern plantation in what has to be the dumbest idea ever to be thought of. She is afraid that something horrible is going to happen to her in Louisiana, and duh, she's right! I think my favorite part of this story is when Crawford takes her to a slave market under the impression it will inspire her because she admits that pain can create good writing, but that it can also create bad writing. This reminds me of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is all purple prose sentimentality. It's so bent on making the reader feel that it loses any dignity of the craft. Orinda also calls herself a toy and describes herself as being in a cage before she knows she is still a slave. A lot of people in any kind of performance, especially those who were on display to promote abolition, are often at the whims of the people who drive their career. Exhibitionist careers are not freeing, even today. These lines are also foreshadowing of what Crawford had left undone. Everything goes to pot when Orinda decides to help slaves escape. I don't blame her for helping the slaves. Too many people turn a blind eye to the horrors of slavery because it would have been too much trouble to their own lives to do something about it. People mostly won't risk anything for others if their lives are livable. A person like Orinda is better than most. Did they escape? I'm not sure. Benz seems to like to leave things open-ended. In some cases, I think this is purposeful ambiguity, and in others, it seems to be because she can't come to a decision. James III is about a child genius whose father is in prison and whose mother is with an abusive man, Carl. When he tries to protect his mom from her boyfriend, Carl punches him in the face, and his mother forces James out of the house. People in abusive homes often feel a sense of displacement, and the story captures that well. You can be the smartest person in the room but still be helpless, especially helpless to assist others. It's a terrible experience. James is lucky that his cousin is there for him, and it is a sad state that no adults are there for him, and that a stranger is more helpful than anyone who's supposed to love him. The struggle that James faces between being manly and also being a child that is scared is one a lot of boys of abuse face. It's why so many of them never bring up what they are experiencing. His father even helps hammer home how much of a man he is supposed to be. I'm not saying this is toxic masculinity because that's an unhelpful moniker for this issue. It's more that expecting a child to behave as an adult is irresponsible. Also, the gendering of abuse by progressives has made this kind of situation worse, not better. It further erases male victims. Feel sorry for his mom all you want, but as James said, she's an adult. Victim or not, she has a responsibility to her children that she is not fulfilling by staying with Carl. Shoving James out the door in November with no shoes is child abandonment. One may argue that she's doing it to protect him, but abandoning him to the possibility of freezing to death or being kidnapped isn't protecting him. Calling the police and pressing charges against Carl would be protecting him. Obviously, this story speaks to me on a level that several of the others in this collection don't, and I feel like it is possibly the bravest of the stories. Snake Doctors is another epistolary story wherein Saul writes a foreword and afterword to a confession that his grandfather had written for the manslaughter of a nurse. The confession was given to Saul after his grandfather Robert died in prison. The weird thing is that the confession is written from both Robert's perspective and his sister's perspective, who had died at 7 when Robert was a child. Robert probably should have been declared insane and a danger to others, but there is no mention of his seeing his sister everywhere he goes. In all likelihood, he had schizophrenia. Based on the fact that Saul didn't even know that Robert was still alive before, suggests that Robert's wife and daughter didn't visit him much and acted as if he was dead. I feel somewhat sorry for Robert. It's not his fault that he was insane. He didn't even commit the act in his own delusions. Instead, his sister did. In his delusions, he also didn't get the woman help, so I feel a bit worse for the woman. Some people would argue that because of where she worked, a fake hospital that took cancer patients' money and let them die, that she deserved to die. I don't think so. The fake doctor deserved to die more so. The nurse may have believed the doctor's lies too. This is one of those tragic stories without real villains and no heroic figures. I say that because, as Saul points out, the doctor doesn't make an appearance. The story is, at its core, sad. It's also one of those stories begging for the classroom to discuss it at length, which annoys me. The Mourners is another Western story wherein Emmeline, daughter of a brothel owner, has just buried her husband after having buried 2 sons with him. Her father calls her back home so that she can marry the mayor to help him have more control over the small town. This one is just as realistic as West of the Known and just as dark. Poor Emmeline is without any control over her life. I think this story is about how the only thing she can control is her body. She uses it in a way she knows her father would hate. It's an act of revenge. I'm not going to say what she did was liberating, or wrong, or even stupid. Emmeline was suffused with grief and anger. I also didn't see that she had any choices on basically anything. Just bad all around. Recognition is about Lee, a successful academic who studies religious groups that shut themselves off from the rest of the world. While visiting the site of one such sect that ended in the death of the whole group, which he had written about, because of a recent discovery, the remains of the members, Lee meets a woman he's sure he knows. Upon talking to her, he starts to believe that the 2 of them are the only surviving members of the sect, and that the bodies are their families and friends, partly from a memory he is struck with of his mother and him running from their home. He believes this so readily that he is willing to torch the bodies of the religious group, an idea cooked up by the woman, even though he has no proof of the woman's claims, nor of his new beliefs. He is not just risking his career, but his very life, because the man who discovered the bodies is hoping to turn the site into a tourist attraction, and has guards with firearms. After setting fire to the bodies, Lee is desperate to know which family he was from within the group, but right before they are both killed, she tells Lee he was never part of the group. This is my favorite of the stories in the collection because it is so strange. While it is couched in the ridiculously elitist language of an academic, something I, as a graduate student, both tend to do and am annoyed by in others, I swear I'm doing it fucking now, it feels like an usurpation of the academic mindset. Lee's so overcome by belief that he cannot adhere to the inhuman way in which academics often behave. He recognizes the humanity of the bodies and the repulsiveness of looking at the bodies as not human, but as subjects to be studied. The fact that he must have a personal connection to feel this way is a sign of how entrenched he is in the divorce from his humanity. In regaining his humanity, he dies. That the connection exists only in his mind shows how desperate he was to reconnect to his humanity, This may be the best story in the collection, or it may be that I am over-interpreting the short story based on the academic language, putting me firmly back into my academic mindset of grad school. I think I'll go read a romance novel now, as a kind of mental face slap. That we may all be one sheepfold, or O Ciculum Corruption, is about a former monk in Tudor England during the split from Rome. Jerome is an orphan raised by the monks until he was 19, when Henry VIII made all monks sign fealty to him over the Pope. If you know Tudor history, then you know this did nothing to stop each monastery and nunnery from being disbanded, their riches stolen, and the poor left to fend for themselves. Jerome learns that the abbot is his father, and that his mother killed herself, but only just before the abbot is put on trial and then executed for treason. Now older, Jerome has killed the man he believes responsible for his father's execution. For how much I love reading about Tudor history, I sure did not like this story. It was short, probably because Benz couldn't maintain the language style needed for long, and also because a reader's interest couldn't be held for long given its language style. But still, I wanted it to be over as quickly as possible. I love Tudor history, just freaking devour it. But I had little patience for this short story. It was weird to end the collection on this story. Recognition probably would have been better, which brings me to a point about anthologies overall. They need to start and end strong. The first story is what gets a reader into the collection, and the last story will color their whole experience of the collection. This one was not a great ending. Its themes of universality and the natural faults of humanity were good ones, but the style was so bleh. And I'm predisposed to not mind the style, having read many of the Tudor monarchy correspondence. It was a mistake to end here, and maybe even a mistake to include the story in the collection. The Man Who Shot Out My Eye Is Dead is hit and miss. Mostly miss. Some of the stories are great, and others could be great, but too many basic story ideas are repeated, such as the greater-than-average intelligence main character, or the woman of very little options. As such, Benz ends up playing with prose style and form to compensate the lack of variety. I would say that Benz has a chance to be an amazing writer, given her ability to switch prose styles so dramatically, as long as she is willing to stay away from overly academic style. Because of the repetitiveness of the stories, many of them are forgettable as they blend together. I think you could skip this collection and not miss out on much. But what did you think of The Man Who Shot Out My Eye Is Dead? Did you love it? Hate it? Which was your favorite story? Which story did you dislike the most? Anything you disagree with me on? Let me know in the comments below. Would you like to see what I'm currently reading? Follow me on goodreads.com/AlexVolTrades to see what I'm reading right now and what book reviews you can expect in the future. I've made a Discord. I'm on it all the time and you're all invited to chat with me. There are channels for video games, movies, TV shows, books, and writing. Even a place for you to promote your own things. Join me there. Everyone is welcome. Merch, 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 merch. Yeah. Check out my new shop at cafepress.com/AlexVolTrades for all kinds of products with my face on them.